is Misty Duke, and as Dr. Valero said, that we're moving towards from kind of a discussion of different disciplines to a discussion of sources of data and research. And so I'm going to be talking about a specific source of data that's often used by research psychologists to study different issues. And I'm actually a legal psychologist, and I study areas pertinent to intelligence. My primary area of research is in intelligence interviewing and interrogation. So I'll kind of be talking a little bit about that. But again, I want to talk about today, behavioral observations. So psychologists tend to study behavior through one of three main ways. We can use physiological measures of behavior, such as MRIs or EEGs, or we can ask people to report on their own behavior, or we can directly observe behavior, which is the focus of this presentation. When we observe behavior, we want to code it just so that we can make some sense of it. We want to try to interpret it to answer our research questions. And so we develop coding systems, and they can range from unstructured to structured. Unstructured systems are more amenable to gathering qualitative data and usually require the observer to make some more extensive interpretations as they record their observations. Whereas structured systems tend to yield quantitative data, and they're typically, the goal is really to try to make them a bit less subjective. Psychologists tend to use structured systems of coding, and which is going to be the focus of this presentation. Any measure of psychological constructs must have two psychometric properties. First, the measure must be reliable, meaning that multiple measures of the same target must be consistent. When dealing with behavioral observations, we're most concerned with the type of reliability called inter-rater reliability. And this is where many observers of the same target will produce similar measurements. So we don't want the observation to be a function of the observer, but actually of the target's behavior. So researchers tend to have more than one observer of each target and then try to examine the consistency of those observations through such calculations as kappa or the interclass correlation coefficient. The other aspect or property is validity, and this has to do with measuring the correct constructs. So constructs are abstract representations of mental models or patterns, and measures of constructs are distinct from the constructs themselves. So for example, if we want to measure the construct pro-social behavior by observing the number of, I forgot to tell you to move along. Sorry, here's where we are. Sorry. I said we have to have, I just got back from a presentation in Seattle. It was all psychologists, and we all have to have slides. If you go to one of those presentations and you don't have slides, you're going to get shunned for life. So there have to be slides here. So
there's a clicker up there too.
Yes. Oh, okay. There's a clicker. The clicker is Larry's finger.
I'll be the clicker.
Oh, I see it. Okay. So, for example, if we want to measure the construct pro-social behavior by observing the number of times someone smiles at another person, we have to ask whether or not the behavior smiling is a representative of the construct pro-social behavior. We also want to consider when we're measuring a construct, is that construct context dependent, or is it stable across contexts? So we can also consider whether observations are made at one point in time, such as observing the behavior of passerby on the street, or at multiple points over time. This latter type of observation, dynamic coding, is intended to evaluate how behavior changes over time, and in response to varying stimuli. And so with dynamic coding, we tend to use interval coding, in which observers code the frequency of behavior during discrete time periods. We can also consider whether we're doing count systems of coding or rating scales. Count systems are based on counts of behavior during specified periods of time. Rating scales, the observer would choose one of several discrete ordinal categories to describe the amount of the behavior. Count systems tend to be more reliable because they're less dependent upon interpretation. So I'm going to discuss how behavioral observation has been and can be applied to 3 areas of research that might be pertinent to intelligence. First, interviewing and interrogation. Second, behavior in secure environments. And then radicalization. I'm going to discuss a few examples of research studies in each area to demonstrate how observation and coding has been conducted. So first we'll start on interviewing and interrogation. Research on interviewing and interrogation informs the intelligence community and intelligence scholars on evidence-based strategies for obtaining accurate, useful information from sources. Both interviewer and source behaviors are measured. And these observations are measuring constructs that are context dependent. So observations of source behavior are intended to measure the construct's either cooperation or maybe resistance. And these behaviors are dependent upon whether or not a person is being interrogated at all, who is doing the interrogation, and what interrogation methods are used. Studies have used, these areas have used both static and dynamic coding, or static and dynamic observations, but static observations are more typical. And studies have used count and rating scale coding as well. So in this sense, a lot of this research is focused on messages being sent by the source and by the interrogator. So there's some similarity with what Dr. Arco was talking about earlier with communication. So first we're going to look at an observational study of the PEACE method. This was an interviewing method that's widely used in the UK. There are 5 phases of the model, and each phase is associated with specific interviewer behaviors. So we have just to give you an example, in the engage and explain phase, you see a list of specific interviewer behaviors. The researchers were interested in examining with what level of skill interviewers were carrying these behaviors out. So 142 recordings of PEACE interviews that were conducted with people suspected of Social Security benefit fraud were coded for 2 constructs. First was interviewer skill. So observers coded interviewing skill along this rating scale. It's called a Likert type scale, from highly skilled performance to need for further training. And so interviewer skill was coded within each phase, and then also overall interview skill across the entire interview. Also, interview outcomes, that was the second construct that was coded. So when conducting observational studies, researchers don't know the ground truth in an interrogation. Is this person really guilty of a crime, or did they really hold valuable information? So interview outcome is measured according to the source's cooperation in providing some kind of information, whether or not that's a confession. So the 2 best outcomes here were considered comprehensive account and confession. So they found that high skill within each phase of the interview was associated with better skill across the entire interview. Furthermore, those interviews rated as being conducted by interviews with higher skill resulted in the most successful outcomes. Another study looked at source behavior specifically. This study looked at sources' use of counter-interrogation strategies in 191 recorded police interviews of terrorist suspects. They used a form of interval coding in which the presence or absence of one of 9 counter-interrogation strategies was coded for each 45-minute interval. And this data was entered into a principal components analysis, which was able to group these 9 strategies into 5 factors, or 5 components, I should say. So there were these 5 main strategies used: verbal, passive verbal, no comment, and retraction. And the researchers actually also compared the different kinds of terrorist suspects and found that all of these types, except for retraction, were most commonly used by paramilitary individuals. So we'll also look at an experimental study. Psychologists really like experiments, and we often study behavior in response to some manipulated stimulus. So I conducted an experimental study recently in which we examined the effect of Army Field Manual interrogation approaches on a source's cooperativeness in an experiment. So we had 2 groups of participants, each of which was interrogated using a series of field manual approaches. So we were looking at within subjects effects, so as each new approach was added, how much more information was shared, and between subjects effects, between the 2 different groups. And we used this paradigm where we convinced people that they were actually being interrogated about a real thing. We had some people were induced to cheat on a test. They were accused of cheating and then interrogated about the testing event. Some people didn't cheat but did engage in rule-violating behavior. And then they were interrogated, and they really thought there were real consequences of the interrogation. Now, we coded information. We had 2 types of information, non-admission details and admission details. And we used interval coding because we were coding information as new information provided during each approach. And we looked at the proportion of details that were shared out of the total number of details available. And we found that there we go. This in yellow, this one interrogation strategy in particular, this was for non-admission details. We saw in condition number 2, that was the approach, an Army Field Manual approach, we know all, was very effective in getting admission details and getting non-admission details as well. So we've also looked at, psychologists have also looked at lie detection accuracy, and how well do people, can they classify deceptive behavior? People usually make deception judgments after watching people either lying or telling the truth. I'm moving kind of quickly because I'm running out of time. But signal detection theory is used to look at discrimination accuracy and response bias in these judges of deception. And being able to tell, the discrimination accuracy is how well are they able to discriminate liars from truth tellers, and response bias is how much evidence do they need to see in order to call someone a liar. And so they were, in this case, they were looking at feedback and motivation in how much they shared. I've just got to move really quickly. There's some coding systems for deceitful behavior as well. So this is where other people can code deceitful behavior. I was going to talk a little more. I guess my time went a lot quicker than I thought it was. I did time it too. As far as secure behavior goes, people have studied human behavior in secure environments and how people might behave in an insecure fashion. These typically are classifying behavior as secure or not secure. There are not a whole lot of studies that actually look at behavior. There's a lot of self-report kind of stuff out there. So I'm recommending that, as in this particular study, people use more flexible coding strategies to look at a range of secure behaviors and a range of types of information from more sensitive to less sensitive. And also that research be done on elicitation methods, separate from the social engineering methods applied in cybersecurity. But the FBI's got a whole list of elicitation methods. And how well are these working, and what can we do to keep people from sharing information when exposed to that? Last thing was political and religious radicalization. There's not been behavioral research here. People do interviews, they do content analysis of records, they do self-report data, but not looking at specific behavior under constrained situations. I thought that it would be nice to do this in social media. Be able to present people with messages and look at their individual factors, also prime them to look at different situational factors and see how they would be able to respond to radicalized messages in a kind of pretend social media site. So I think that this source of data needs to be more widely applied in intelligence studies. It's not applied a whole lot, much more applied in the field of psychology. That's it.